was 12 at the time. He went to a local school out in Mayfair, and they had a number of players from Orlando Pirates, if you can recall, Cassie. They
yes, it was pre-primary.
Yes, pre-primary. With I think it was principal was
Kalicharan.
Yes, yes, yes. And he doesn't live very far from me. And he often asks me about Luther. And that was a wonderful group of youngsters. And I would like to know if some of the other boys there made it, but Luther was a part of that. And Luther was found by me once when we were training out in Cecil Payne Stadium. That's a stadium on the way to Florida. And we used this facility, and I saw this young kid. And something just struck me because, you know, he had this sudden burst of pace, good skill, and he was 11 years old at the time. And I approached his dad, and I said to his dad, would you be prepared to give me this kid? But, you know, the difficulty at that time, Cassie, was we didn't have an under 10 or 11 or even under 12 or under 14 team. We only had a Vodacom team, which is now the Motsepe League team, which consisted of players like May Mashlango, Tokelo Ranti, Sibusiso Kumalo, Tefu Mashamaiti, Surprise Ralani, who's now currently playing at Cape Town City, has been a sensation, also played in Europe. So he had to just tag along. So he had to come to training, never could play, but he persevered. And I think the exposure he had with these older boys really prepared him for big things to come. But later on, we then managed to have a junior team, which he played in, which was the under 16s. But he was just above that level. And within a few months after that, I introduced him to play in the Castle team, which we then sold the status, which was Alex United. We sold that status, the Vodacom team, and we bought a Castle team because it was more financially feasible. Because, you know, with the Motsepe League, you got to look at players salary-wise, etc. And we just didn't have the resources. So Luther, his first game was in Noordgesig, where he comes from. And he was playing against his father's team that he grew up in. And Luther was really so scared on the day, and I called him and I said, boy, you know, this is an opportunity for you. If you're going to not be mentally strong, you're never going to be able to do it. So go out there and show the community of Noordgesig what you're capable of. And he had a blistering game, Cassie. I mean, his father came to me and he was in tears, basically crying and saying, I don't know what you've done to this child, but I'm so, so impressed. Luther just turned it on. And then I think it was a year or two later, we sent him to Sweden. And he played for Orebro, I think, there. He did absolutely well. So he spent approximately 5 or 6 years being developed, being trained, and he persevered with older boys, never complained. And later on, Pule Maritsani, Cabello Dlamini, who's playing at Pirates now, they came along and he fell into that team. So he had a team that he played in. And he just blossomed with time. The good thing about Luther is he's got a very strong mental approach. He's a player who's got this never say die attitude. And he loves challenges. And this is something that we constantly motivated him. But he was not the only one. There was a lot of other players that had his attributes. So it rubs off. When you play with good players, when you play with players that have strong mentalities, it rubs off. And they build this bond. So wherever we played, these boys used to really do extremely well. And people really marveled at the way they played. So it was no surprise to me when many of them ended up in Europe. Some of them are now currently playing in the Premiership. And the good thing is, Cassie, we have an outstanding under-14 team now. I'm just marveling at them. We've had them for 4 years. And the kids from different backgrounds. In fact, we have a white goalkeeper. You know, normally, you don't get that many white boys playing in these teams of excellence. And we saying, let's open our doors to everybody because this kid is just showing so much potential. He's grown. So we've got a few white kids. We've got a few Indian kids as well. So we're saying football is there for all. And with the right development, they're starting to show very good signs. So I'm very impressed, and I'm looking forward to them being the next generation of players after Luther and them that will emerge and add value, not just to Stars of Africa, but to our national teams. Because over a period now, we've had players in Bafana, we have had players in the under-23s, we've had players in the under-20 as well as the under-17s. Another boy there, Tibang Pete, plays for Guimarães in Portugal. He was with us for a number of years from Kimberley. And he also went to Portugal a number of years ago, at least 6 years ago. So he's also with Bafana, fantastic player, played for them a while ago, when he was called upon. He's now been called back. He was called for the game before. There's the 2 games against Zimbabwe and Ghana, but he contacted COVID, and then he was kept in quarantine and sent back. So he's also been called up. Extremely difficult, Cassie. In this industry, it's a case of dog eat dog. People will come and they'll approach players behind your back. You've got to guard against all that. We try to ensure that players are loyal, but players also have families that they have to see to. They have needs at home, and there's a lot of impatience, and there's also this desire to play professional football. So sometimes we lose players. I don't want to mention particular names, but we lost all the players playing in the PSL. We didn't get a blue cent for them, and they're playing professional football. So the 5 or 6 years that I spent with them and money that I invested, because some of them I have to pay for their schooling up to about 2,500 because they can't cope with normal schooling. So I send them to a homeschooling setup, which is close to us, which is much more suited to them, more personal attention, etc., etc. But there is times when we are able to obviously get a return on our investment. That's when we send players to Europe. We have a partner, Nadim is my partner. He's based in Europe, in Portugal. So what we do is we take a player like Luther Tubang. There was another player, Juninho Palace. We take these players down to Europe. That's after the likes of May and Tokello and all the other players that have been there. They spend the time at the club, and we sign an undertaking that once they move on, we take a percentage of what the club sells them for. So example, if Luther moved now, he moved to Sweden, we would get 15% of whatever the transfer fee has been where Luther is concerned. And that is how we managed to run the academy. But also what helps us to run the academy is the commercial side, because we have kids that pay to come and train. So they obviously help us in paying our coaches and our match fees and our use of the field and the league fees, etc. So it's been very tight and difficult. We do think that if we had the resources and the sponsorship, we could really take this to another level. So we have to wait a while as well, Cassie, because it doesn't take a year or 2 to develop a player. It takes between 7 to 9 years, as I said earlier on. In an ideal world, up to 10 years, if you cover him from the age of 6, by 16 or 17. In a normal situation in Europe, players start showing potential. We saw Man City the other day playing in the Carabao Cup, and they had so many 19-year-olds. And that's an ideal that you want to achieve. So it is something that is difficult to swallow when you see a player going to a club, because ideally what would be the case is if SAFA could say to the clubs, listen, you've got to pay some sort of compensation. The compensation is minimal. If you look at giving a club 2,500 for a year, but I spent 2,500 just on the boys' education, that's besides his accommodation, his food, his transport, his training. It cost me between 8,000 and 10,000 per player. Now, if you look at that and he spends 5 years, Cassie, it's a huge amount of money. But if we're going to get 2,000 per year for 5 years, that's 10,000 bucks. It's peanuts. So there should be a clause, because if you take your child to me and he trains with me and he plays in the league, you can demand his clearance after a year, because you're only allowed to keep him for a year. So this is the challenge we're faced with. And I think this is sad, because in countries like Brazil, etc., they encourage small business enterprise, meaning they encourage the small guy to develop players as well, because then they create a bigger base. And that is the reason why you find 3 and 4 players playing Champions League in Brazil, because from Brazilian playing in the Champions League, because they have such a huge talent base that they are able to export the cream. And we can only get that cream if we give Joe Bloggs on the corner with his little academy the proper education and the funding to develop players in his little area or his little township or his little town. And if we do that, we're going to have to, you ran the under 14 thing. We had so much talent coming out of those tournaments. Our national teams were so much stronger and more consistent. And since those tournaments have been cancelled or whatever, we don't see those talents. In the past, we used to have tournaments. I remember the one time we had tournaments in 4 provinces that we ran for the under 12s. And the quality that came out, we had coaching workshops. So there was an exchange of knowledge and information and talent identification. Players like Stephen, you know how we got Stephen. We got him from one of our satellites in Bosman, went on to play for Everton. And there's so many others, Zita Mafukim, Oljon Mambizela. The list is endless. So I think if we can eventually get back to that, coming back to your question, how we make money, we don't really make lots of money. We wait for that one big hit. Claiming now compensation from the club that Luther is going to. And it's quite a nice sum of money that you get for that because it's in euros. So you can get between 400 and 500,000 for compensation. But now, how often are you going to have a Luther going through? You understand what I'm saying? Your bread and butter players that are playing in the PSL, that are playing for smaller clubs, this is where you also need to get some compensation because you've invested in them. And this is where I feel clubs should, by right, say, look, this is a fund we're putting aside for people that develop as an incentive so that you as Cassie who's developing players is going to say, wow, my hard work is not going to be such where I'm not going to be rewarded for it. So I think in South Africa, a lot of people, and I mentioned, I'm maybe at a different level of this structure. Guys at the bottom are even worse off. I mean, guys that develop players at township level don't get a blue penny. If they get a set of kit or balls, they're lucky. And I think it's totally unfair. They should also get something too, so that they can continue doing what they're doing, because those are the most important people in scouting the first talent. You know, we had Maslubi at Chiefs. He used to bring, the guy wasn't a well-educated person, but he had an eye for talent. And he would bring Jabu Pule to me, Isaac Mabotsa, Tantla Kubeka, Junior Kani, all these players he brought to me. And the success I had at Chiefs as a consequence was because of his scouting. I had to obviously develop these players, but if he didn't scout the right players, I wouldn't have been able to achieve what I did. I know clubs have become reliant on starting programs. Their programs costed between 8 and 9 million a year, believe me. And if you look at the fact that not all the players they develop are of that high level, and obviously there's many reasons for that. I don't want to go into that now. But I think it starts with SAFA saying to the clubs that this is a ruling. This happens in Europe. Europe, if you don't pay compensation and I report you to FIFA, you're in big trouble. They're going to dock your points. They're going to suspend your matches. So clubs realize they have to pay. You know, they got no alternative but to pay that man who started the development of this particular individual. And it's not only that guy. You can claim compensation even if you coach that kid after 13, because it starts from 13 up. So during that cycle from 13 up to the time he moves to a professional club, every person involved can claim compensation. What we see is girls are allowed to play in a younger age group. So if a girl is 10, she can play in an under 8. And obviously because we want to give girls the opportunity to also take part in organized football, and there's not enough girls' teams. So when a girl comes to us, we take her into the program, but we allow her to play in a boys' team that is younger. You get what I'm saying? But the important thing is that women's football should be a priority in South Africa. We've just had the ladies' team doing exceptionally well in their tournament in Nigeria. And that is simply because of the amount of effort that was put into their development a number of years ago by Fred, Hilton Smith, and several other people that ensured that these girls were taken for proper development to the sports science in Pretoria. What do you call it? The Tux Institute of Science, Sports Science. And you can see now we have several players that are playing at AC Milan, that are playing in Spanish La Liga teams, etc. And that is why I was not surprised when they beat the powerhouses of African football, Nigeria and Ghana. So why is it that we're not doing the same with girls' football at primary school level, at high school level? We still have too few girls playing the sport, you know. And I think it should be compulsory that every PSL team should have a ladies' team and should have a development program, because it's important that we also promote women's football. Obviously the case, I think government, corporate, the footballing body must sit around the table and look at the plan now and ensure that they get people around the table, people that have been in the sport. Cassie, you guys can assist there in bringing this together and ensuring that we have holistic development across the board. We should have those little satellites in the different townships and ultimately have a high-performance center based in Gauteng, where all of these different provinces have mini centers where kids come, where we're able to go through all of this bulk talent, this mass participation, and then from that, provincial teams, LFA teams can start finding diamonds that we can now promote, and hopefully our national teams will prosper. I think we're performing at 50%. If we put these structures into place, we can become a powerhouse in Africa. We can become the #1 team in Africa. I'm very confident about that. In an ideal world, you want to start scouting players as young as 6 and 5 years old. Obviously, during that stage, it's more about fun. It's more about the player experiencing what it is to play with the ball. It's not so much about specific scientific coaching. And by the time a player is 19, he should be, or 18, he should be in the professional ranks in an ideal world. Obviously, when you talk about third world countries, it's not always possible because, you know, due to economic and social aspects, you don't often find kids coming to you at that young age. And also, sometimes the structures that are in place aren't able to facilitate early childhood development in football. So in our context, I can speak from a South African perspective, we often find talent as, I would say, the earliest at 14 or 15 years old. And already then, Sean, they've missed out 2 or 3 stages of development, which is so essential. It's equal to sending your child to school when he's 14. You know, you send your child to school when he's 6 or 7, simply because he needs to go through all those different steps of learning. And the same applies in football. So what then happens is, we as coaches have to do remedial training. We got to go back to doing the basics, teaching him the most fundamental skills. And he could be a natural talent. A point in question is Jabu Mashlango, Jabu Pule. Phenomenal talent. I only had the pleasure of working with him when he was 16, turning 17. I would have loved to have worked with him when he was 6 years old so that I could put the right building blocks into place. So yes, I would say as early as possible, scout the kid, put him in the right setup, ensure that he gets the right age-appropriate training, because age-appropriate training is very important. You don't coach a 6-year-old like you would coach a 12-year-old or an 18-year-old. It's totally different from a pedagogic, from a didactic, how you speak to him, how you make him understand, where the game becomes the coach, where you do very little coaching. And I think this is a mistake a lot of young coaches do. When they deal with 6 and 8-year-olds, they want to overemphasize how to kick the ball, how to stop the ball. They should let the game do that. They should set up a game, let the kids play, and they will learn by doing, rather learn by being told what to do. Kid shows potential, and we have a kid now. There's 2 kids that we have in the under 14. One's name is KG, and the other one is Viano. These are 2 exceptional talents. At this present moment, they are training with the seniors. And the reason I do that is to expose them to ILO, because it's becoming too easy for them in the under 14s. But I also have to be careful that I don't expose them to competition where they can get injured and hurt. Because if they play against older players, and in our league, you only have to have 6 players under 23. The rest could be any age. You know, it doesn't matter. So you've got to be careful that you don't expose the player or the youngster to situations where he could get injured. So I would bring them in a SAB game, last 10, 15 minutes, and I give them instructions not to hang on to the ball, to get rid of it as quick as possible, not to expose themselves to 1v1 situations too often. And with the late developers, again, you've got to be patient. But as a coach, you've got to make sure that you identify those hidden skills and talents. And that takes a trained eye. That comes with experience, where you see a player and you are tempted to send him back and say, look, this player just doesn't seem to be developing at the rate you want him to. But something tells you that, listen, he's going through puberty, because that's something we need to respect as well. When players go through puberty, suddenly they've got growth spurts. Suddenly they have an interest for the opposite sex. Suddenly all these other distractions come into place. And if you don't know how to manage that, you could lose a very exceptional talent. Something that must be implemented is, you know, we look at the Dutch and we look at the success they've had with developing players over the last 3 or 4 decades, from the time of Louis van Gaal and all the other coaches that came through, including Johan Cruyff and them. But it all started with a vision and a mission. And if you look at their population per capita and you look at the number of players they developed, it's phenomenal. I mean, they've been to several World Cup finals, not winning them. I think they were a little unfortunate in some cases, but they produced the best talent. And Ajax of Amsterdam is a great example. Now, what they do is what you just said now is they mirror the game. In other words, the training becomes a mirror of the game and the game becomes a mirror of the training. And this is where they expose these kids to high intensity games in small areas. This is where kids hone that skill to be able to deal with the pressures of sport, because the modern game is all about speed. The game is much faster, there's less space, and your technique has to be impeccable. So if you do these small-sided games with different conditions, because they play games where they have multiple goals, and the reason for that is for players to learn how to change the point of attack, players to read situations much better, and all of these different conditions that they create within their small-sided games has been very instrumental in the growth and the development of their players. So if in South Africa, as a whole, if we can have corporate investing in small-sided games, in schools, for example, I think we as footballing loving people should appeal to corporate that, listen, let's get small-sided games in schools. There's a guy named Horst Wayne. He's late now, but he designed a game called Playing Intelligence. He's a German tactician. And as we speak, the German Federation is embracing that concept, where the game becomes the teacher, where you work from basic to intermediate, where you as a coach stand outside the game and you observe and you take notes and you only give instruction at certain moments. So the small-sided games is an ideal tool to develop players and ultimately have these players become world-class talents. If you look at third world countries like Brazil, futsal is a very important aspect of their development. If you look at players like Ronaldinho, and I'm sure many others, part of their upbringing is due to futsal. Futsal is a very dynamic game. Futsal is a game where players learn to refine fine motor skills. And that is so important in the modern game, because if technique is absent in conjunction with tactics, because for a player to develop to a complete footballer, he needs to have both technical excellence as well as tactical awareness. So if he has the technical ability but not the tactical ability, then he's not a complete player. And futsal is the entry point. And I think it would be fantastic if we can take all these unused tennis courts around the country and convert them into futsal courts where kids can come and play. Because you must understand, you have to open up futsal and small-sided games to all kids. Doesn't matter the skill level, doesn't matter the ability. And as a process, this huge number of kids that play will ultimately, you'll be able to choose the best talents from this wide range of mass participation that will ultimately emanate into excellence. Because without a huge base, without having mass participation, you can't have excellence. And I think futsal can be a huge tool to ensure that we have mass participation, where scouts can come and find those special players. It's criminal. If there was a policing system, coaches that have 12-year-olds playing on full fields should be charged and maybe even given a bit of a fine or even a jail sentence, because it's criminal. Really, it is. I mean, if you look at the biological individuality, the biological makeup of a child of 12, where in heaven's name is he going to be able to cover that distance? Secondly, how often does he get the ball? Because I'm sure you've seen, Sean, when they play, it's like a bun fight. Wherever the ball is, you have these kids running, like swarming like bees around. There's no ways that you can develop footballers on a big field. You want them to have maximum amount of touches. And the only way you can do that is to play small-sided games. So if FIFA says that, and they say a smaller size goal, it's because this is not a young adult. This is a youngster. This is a junior. This is a kid that we're talking about. So we must never confuse football by trying to ensure that a kid plays an adult game. It's just not going to work. And we've seen it in the past where kids don't develop properly because of playing on these big fields. In fact, I had a game in Soweto once, and I was fuming. I called the coaches and said to the coaches, they were playing, how can you do this? And then they apologized profusely and said, Coach, sorry, we didn't know you were here. I said, doesn't matter if I'm here or anybody else. You don't do that. You know, a kid should never be playing on of 12 years old, should never be playing on a full pitch. But when FIFA do their research and when they make use of expertise, they make use of the best expertise, they come up with plans that is suitable for the different age groups. And I mean, we need to take a cue from them as being the mother body or the governing body in world football, to say they are educating, they're spending millions on educating coaches because they want to ensure that football, the product, grows and it becomes a spectator attraction as such. train 5 or 6 times a week. So yes, it's not sufficient time. We want kids to be exposed to at least, depending on the age, minimum of 3 sessions if they are under 12. Minimum. And I say minimum, I'm saying based on the fact that we would like to have more time to be able to ensure that we cover all the different aspects of their development, because you must understand football is competing with many outside factors. They're competing with social media, television, etc., etc. And the more time youth coaches have, the more they are able to enhance and refine those fine skills. Because if the technique of a player is developed, then later on in life, football becomes easy. Talk about a player like Brent, talk about some of the other players like Dylan Shepherd, etc., that came from the generation. When they went to clubs, they were welcomed with open arms because their technique was so refined. They could trap a 60-meter pass. They could pass a ball over distances. Their first touch was phenomenal. And this is what we got at the school. Although at that time, we were also experimenting and learning. We had just gotten back from Brazil, etc. And we learned as much as they learned, we learned as much from them as young players, which is what I always say to young coaches. Experience can never be replaced. There's no replacement for experience. So all the information you learn in coaching courses is only useful to you when you put it to the test. When you learn through doing and learn through failing and making mistakes, you as a coach is also developing. Sometimes the two clash. When you're talking about training sessions in a week and the kids got certain schools, it becomes compulsory for them to play a specific sport. We try to complement it in whichever way we can. It's not always something we enjoy doing, but we have to because the kid is in a private school or he's got a bursary, etc. We've got a kid now who's playing for the Lions, phenomenal footballer. And the reason they chose him, they said, look, whatever you're doing in football has taught you so much in as far as awareness, decision-making, etc. And he's now being chosen for the Sevens as well. So he's a player that we felt had all the attributes to go all the way. When his parents came to us, we said to them, look, we will still look at him being part of our program, but we're not going to deprive him from playing rugby because he's got a bursary. And, so it's going to come to a point, I said to the dad the other day, you're going to have to choose. He's now 13. When it comes to around about 16, you'll have to choose. And it's a very difficult decision to make. Hopefully, it will be a decision that benefits the kid and his future as such. So it's a difficult one, but specialization has to come at a certain point where a child has to now realize that with the time available, I have to focus only on one sport, because if I play too many sports, I'm not going to be able to excel in one. Challenges with under 10 players is such that because of the lack of physical education at school, a lot of them are still uncoordinated. Their coordination, their ability to, even their running and their jumping and their turning, the basic movement is not refined. And you gotta implement lots of fun games for them to learn these skills. Because if you start doing drills with under 10s, they quickly lose concentration and they quickly lose interest. So if under 10 decides to have a break and sit on the ball, you let him do so. You don't become regimental, because at that stage of his development, you want him to enjoy what he's doing. And the minute you become too regimental, he will lose interest and he will start disliking the sport. So you got to ensure that at that stage, with all these deficiencies that he has, you create coaching methods or coaching exercises or drills to have fun. For example, handball. For example, a jack in the middle where you throw the ball. So they're having fun, but they don't realize they're improving those movements. They're improving their eye, ball coordination. They're improving their agility, and this is the way of doing coaching indirectly. So I would say with younger kids, coach indirectly. Don't make them think you are coaching them. Make them understand that they're having fun and playing games. A number of factors that are involved. Firstly, there's not enough development taking place at grassroots. I think at grassroots, you mentioned earlier that the parents put tremendous pressure on these kids. They want to live their dreams through their kids. And you'll find a child going home crying. I've seen this on a number of occasions where kids are left crying because they didn't win a match and the dad is on their backs, the coach is on their backs. So I think from a youth perspective, we're doing that wrong. We should not be putting these kids through these traumatic experiences. And then you find the lack of school sports is also a factor. You look at a country like Australia, 25% of the gross budget goes towards sport. And they teach kids basic movement. They have sports at school, and ultimately the child chooses what sport he wants to play. They are not known to be a footballing nation, but I think if you look at them pound for pound, they're ahead of us, and they would probably give us a run for our money. And we've seen that in the past where they have several players playing in the European leagues. So that is the other. The other thing is the mental aspect. Our players are not mentally prepared to play in Europe. I think too often they can't deal with the challenges that they face. We come from a society where confidence is a huge factor. We don't encourage players to be confident. We want them to toe the line when it comes to the way they conduct themselves to their peers, etc. We don't allow them to be outspoken and ask questions. It's a case of you do what I tell you, don't do what I do, but do what I tell you. So from that perspective, we need to change that as well. And I think also the quality of coaching that we do, we miss out a lot on the fundamentals and the different stages of development. So these are a number of factors that contribute to players struggling there. Some of them feel it's better to come back home and play for a local club because clubs here are paying quite a good salary for players. I mean, we pay better wages than what players get in Sweden and in Denmark. I mean, I'm talking about the smaller entry level teams. Even though they're playing in euros, there are players here that are earning close to $1 million a month, top players. So why go to Europe when you can earn that money here? So that hunger and desire that you speak about from Ghanaians, Nigerians, etc., is such because that's their escape from poverty. That's their meal ticket. That's their ticket to becoming famous and successful. But also, they play a lot of informal football. Those kids, when they grow up, they play a lot of football when there's no pressure. And when they get scouted, they get put into development programs. So when you look at Sadio Mane, don't look at him as a player who just came from Senegal and ended up playing in a top club in Europe. He had to go through different stages. He had to play in France, in the smaller divisions, in the lower leagues, and he had to work his way up. And the coaching he received, Sean, has now made it possible for him to become a top player at Liverpool. So it's a process. Not every player, it's not a fairy tale where a kid goes from Nigeria and is an instant success. A lot of these kids go to Europe at a very young age. Some of them just go there illegally, live in the country, and a lot of them live on the street. And they're looking at this dream of playing for a top team. Some of them get scouted very early on, and they are put into the proper development academies in Europe. And often you hear people say the French team is an African team, but we don't realize the amount of work the French have done to ensure that those players reach that level. So yes, they are from Africa, but it's Europe that educated them and developed them to become these top players. This is a guiding light. What Pizza has achieved should be giving all local coaches the understanding and the willpower and the determination to look at coaching in other countries around the world. And I think we have a group of fantastic young and up and coming coaches. We've proven a lot of these coaches, including Benny McCarthy, Manova Ngiti, and several other coaches have proven beyond a doubt that they have the ability to coach at the highest level. I think we need to start aiming higher. I do think that coaches need to become more ambitious. They need to apply for positions elsewhere because a lot of the foreign coaches that come here are coaches that don't really excel in their own countries because it wouldn't make sense to leave Euros to come and work for Rennes. So when they come here, they're also improving their series. They're also gaining experience. And that is at the expense of local football. But it's something that I think has happened over a period of time where club owners feel they're in better hands with coaches from Europe because at that time, a lot of South African coaches didn't have the qualifications, didn't have the experience, and it would be a case of a former player becoming a coach and then he fails because he hasn't got a coaching qualification and he doesn't exactly know how to go about doing it. And then we suddenly say he's not good enough. But I think that has changed because the world has become very small as far as education is concerned. The world has become very small in as far as coaching and development is concerned. We find now that people are able to get information on the internet, to go on courses abroad, to go to different parts of the world and study. We've had, you mentioned Pizzo, he's done courses abroad. I attended the professional license with him here at SAFA. So I think by improving your knowledge of the game and being given the platform and the opportunities, we can produce some phenomenal coaching expertise. Hit the nail on the head. I think with the different coaches coming from different parts of the world, coming with their own philosophies, their own styles, their own game models, it's really diluted our football to a large extent. And we've said that a number of years ago when Ted Dimitro was around. We mentioned that you need to have a South African philosophy style of play. Obviously, coaches will have different tactical approaches, strategies, etc., but a unique style. If you go to Rio, where we started coaching in 1992, is the first time we went there. The ladies that play on the beach play the same way that the national team plays. They play with a 4-4-2 formation. They play with wingbacks overlapping. They play a possession-based game. And that is common throughout, even though clubs differ by playing sometimes with 3 men at the back, etc. But the philosophy is ingrained. Now, what you have is, when you have coaches coming to clubs and coming with their own philosophies, what happens when they leave? The new coach comes in, players are confused, they need to adapt. So it causes a lot of problems. But coming back to what you said about youth coaches, they're also at a huge disadvantage because we prepare a player based on his strengths as a South African player, his speed, his skill. And suddenly the coach that he goes to is looking for different attributes. So often you send a player for trials and you look at this player, for example, and you ask yourself the question, why is it that Luther Singh, Tokelo Ranti, all these players were not scouted for South African teams? And yet they were good enough to play in Europe. And you ask the question, why is it? It's simply because the coach at the time had a different idea of what he saw as a player for that particular club. And this really makes football a case of, lotto in some ways, because you don't know what to expect from the club. At one season, they play a certain way. The next coach comes, he plays a certain way. And now the players are at a disadvantage because certain players can't adapt to his style of play. But if a club has got something ingrained, written in stone, the coach has to change. He has to change his, and often you find the club looks for a coach who can complement their philosophy and style of play. If you look back, Cassie, a while ago, we had Oscar, he was one of our first technical directors, and he came with the German concept of football. But German football has evolved since then. German football has made use of other expertise. They've got coaches like Pep Guardiola who came there to Bayern Munich, and they've learned. The Germans are people that don't sit on a concept. They always look to evolve and to improve and to perfect. We've used a concept that is 40 years old, basically, and we haven't changed it. So our syllabus is still the Hoskrit syllabus that he brought 30 years ago. And this is what we're teaching, basically, through the different levels. So we haven't adapted the syllabus in its entirety to suit youth development and football in general. But in saying that, there's always value in learning because they do teach a lot of good things. They teach a lot of good things as far as technical, tactical, psychological, social development is concerned, physical development, but it's not in line with the best models that we see in Europe and elsewhere. So we got to change with the times. We got to adapt. We need to reinvent ourselves. We need to look at what modern trends are, which is what we don't do. We go to the Olympics, we go to World Cup competitions, we get knocked out, we don't come home with a point. We just sweep it under the table. We don't have a introspection or a workshop to say what went wrong, how can we improve, how can we do better going forward. So it means that the next guy comes in and the same thing happens. It's been like this for decades now, where we go to these tournaments, we come back, and we don't share what we've learned at these tournaments. We don't have like a boss barad and sit with the coaches and say, look, these are the trends that we need to improve on. You guys at grassroots, you need to make sure that your players are better in 1v1 situations. They can't head the ball properly. You need to ensure that they learn to head the ball properly. We need to introduce different aspects of heading. To give you, just before I forget, something I learned in Brazil. Kids, when they start playing football, they don't head the ball. They head a balloon. They head a plastic ball. And the reason is simple, because you don't want to traumatize those kids when the ball hits them on the eye, etc. And we in South Africa are very weak in heading the ball. Often you find a player right in front of goal count. It's because that first experience was the most traumatic. We don't teach them the fundamental skills, and we don't teach them in the correct way. So I think with the syllabus that we have at the moment, I just think we need to look at it closely and say, what can we do to improve it? And also to make sure that we just don't have numbers, because I think our target as SAFA was to get a couple of thousand coaches qualified, which they did. But now these coaches are not employed. These coaches don't have employment. So a lot of guys just have certificates that they put on the wall, but we haven't created employment for them. And this is coming back to what I said to you earlier, Casey. If we have corporates getting involved with development where we can empower these coaches to work in schools, where we can get former players to become coaches, because a lot of these former players don't even have employment. What better thing than to educate them and let them share their valuable experience with the next generation? So, these are things that should be done. Extremely negatively. I think if you can recall, we had under 12, which was the known. Was it under 12, the known? Then we had the Transnet under 14, then we had the under 17, then we had the Caltex calls, then we had Coca-Cola that invested in under 17 projects. And these were very, very, very important stages of a player's development, because you would know a player who played in the under the known cup and under 14. So you had some sort of idea as these players were coming through. I mean, you had a list of players that you knew who played under 17, and then you follow them through their careers. This is not going to happen if you have under 19s. And also because the under 19 teams are sometimes selected in provinces based on the guy that's been selected as the provincial coach. He could be choosing his own players. There could be a lot of biases. A lot of talented players are going to be absent or left out. And this is not how football should be. I mean, if you look at currently how our national teams are being selected, they select from the bigger clubs. Yet you find talent all over the country that's being ignored. But if we had these competitions, it would make it easy for the national coach. He wouldn't have to call Sundowns or Chiefs or Pirates alone. He would then go to the tournament where these players are also a part of, because they'd be selected for the province. And that's the best players in the province. And that's why our teams are so strong, because the coaches could come to the under 17 interprovincial and choose the best under 17. So too with the under 20s. And that would eventually become your under 23s. So I think that should be brought back. I think SAFA should do everything in their power to bring those different interprovincial tournaments back. We even had the schools taking a part in that tournament, if you can recall. They were one of the provinces that, not province, but one of the entities that took part in that special tournaments.